So we're going to talk about Gothic architecture now, and we just covered the Pisa complex, which for me was a transitional complex between 800 and 1150, which really places it more in the Romanesque era, and depends on who your teacher is, but it has a lot of Byzantine flavor to it. So now we're going to move into the Gothic, and remember when we were talking about the baptistry at Pisa, how it kind of possessed some superior types of architectural technology. We're going to be doing is talking about that same thing when it comes to looking at Gothic architecture. And the Gothic period, it's not really like taking a bus where the periods end in distinct times and you have to catch it at just the right moment. What I'm kind of suggesting to you is that each of the periods is a little bit different, and sometimes you have overlap in the different time periods, but the Gothic period really seems to run between 1150 and 1350. But what you're going to see is that in terms of painting, there's a lot of painting that starts around 1300 that I will refer to as Proto-Renaissance. Let's start by talking about the technologies. The technology of Gothic architecture begins all the way back in the 1st century in Rome, with buildings like the Colosseum and also buildings like the Pantheon, where barrel vault technology is really significant and causes them to expand more space, to use cement and masonry, and then face it or facade it with better materials afterwards. So it's a cheaper way of building things, but it's also a superior technology to post and lintel. Now, remember, we also talked about Constantine's Basilica and how it had cross vaults in it, or groin vaults in it, that also open the space up a lot more. And you can see that in cross vaults, what you have are these piers where the force is transmitted down into 4 corners, and you can really span quite a lot of space with that. And it's a very safe kind of design. You just build scaffolds and all the force gets transmitted down the sides into the piers. The next major innovation, there are actually 2 of them in the Gothic era, are taking groin vaults and then adding sort of diagonal ribs. And the way that the ribs were made are basically they're carved stone, almost bricks or ribbing that looks like pipes, and they would insert wrought iron pegs into each end and peg these things together, and it would create an extra additional support that would allow a complex rib vault to be built, and allows them to span a lot more space. And one of the concepts that comes out of this is the form and the function are wedded together, that it's a beautiful form and it evolves directly out of the function of the arches. So it's kind of a very honest or true architecture where you see any kind of ribbing and any kind of vaulting literally supports the building, and they're both beautiful and functional at the same time. This is also going to be augmented by something called flying buttresses that we're going to look at later on. This is an interior computer simulation on the left-hand side and an actual shot of what those 2 structures look like. And what I'm showing them to you for is to show you, first of all, look at how tall the windows are on the clerestory that's at the very top of the building. And part of this is that they decide that they're going to build super tall, and they use pointed arches inside Gothic cathedrals, sort of like what we saw in the cathedral in Pisa. The cross groin vaults that are augmented by this ribbing are extremely strong, and you can see this sort of herringbone pattern of bricks that are run in the top. And the way that they did this is they would build a wooden scaffold, and they would then put the ribbing across there, and there would be wood underneath that, and they would raise this stuff. A guy would be in like basically a big gerbil wheel that would raise these things. They called it the Great Wheel, and they would put the masonry down, and then they would coat those arches on the top side, not the side we're looking at, actually with cement, often to lock it into place. And then they would pray like hell when they removed the scaffold that it didn't fall or didn't fail. And a lot of buildings did actually fall and fail. But what this allows them to do is build extremely tall, elegant buildings with a lot of windows running down the sides, and so there's a lot of light inside buildings like this. So let's take a look at the plans and how they evolve, the footprint of the building. So the evolution of the building and the footprint of the floor plan, you can see on the left-hand side, I actually have a diagram that is the original St. Peter's from about 318, 315 in Rome. on Vatican Hill. And you can see it's a typical tau plan. It has an apse at the end, and the transept makes it look almost like a capital T with a little bump on the end. If you look at the cathedral plan on the right-hand side that we're looking at, you can see it's a little bit more of a Latin plan, and it has several chapels that run all along the top of it because they wanted to have additional chapels. Remember, we discussed that in terms of the cathedrals. And there were ways of getting in and out of the building. There were more porches on it that you would enter in through some of the transepts to get there. Wherever you see an X there, it's actually a rib groin vault. And you have a large nave, you have a tripartite division, and remember that there would be no benches or anything in them. Usually, Gothic cathedrals opened on the west side and were pointed towards the east, towards Jerusalem. Now I want to talk about the evolution of the Gothic style from the actually early Christian all the way through the Byzantine and the Romanesque. Number one on this screen here is actually St. Peter's, and it was actually a timbered building with a short, squat clerestory on it. After a while, we have a more Romanesque style of building. That's number two. And it has a tripartite division, again, where you have two side aisles and you have a nave. And the term nave comes from shipbuilding. And basically, the hull of a ship upside down kind of looks like a nave, and so we get that. Then what happens is there's an evolution. In 2 and 3, that's the Romanesque style. They start to build taller, but you still have a very short clerestory, and I'm going to point at that for you. This is the clerestory here where the light would come in. But then in number 4 and number 5, what starts happening is there's an evolution, and you can see how this evolution changes in the bottom diagram. What happens is they start building the nave to be taller, and that allows for a series of windows to be installed along the sides of the clerestory that allow a lot of light in. But if you build the buildings extremely tall like that, you need to have support, because otherwise the building would become very thick, the piers and the supports. So what they did was they moved the supports to the exterior of the building. So for instance, I'm pointing at diagram number 5 here. What you have is these are actually sort of bridges that run on the exterior of the building that are called flying buttresses. And the side aisles here are solid roofs, and then this is open to the air, and it's an exoskeleton. It's basically an exterior supporting structure. And you can see that the rib groin vault and the flying buttresses tend to allow them to build the buildings taller and thinner and have a lot more windows. Now these sort of pinnacles on the top of each one of these buttresses here actually send force straight down, vertically down, and keep a little bit extra weight so that the buttresses can't topple over. So let's take a look at some more diagrams of this. What I have here on the screen is actually on the left-hand side a typical Romanesque building. You can see that it uses barrel vaults that are just straight Roman arch with a barrel vault running down the nave and the side aisles. And the Gothic style, you can see that they use pointed arches. They have the flying buttresses, and they have pinnacles that sort of cement the force down vertically to keep the flying buttresses in place. And this computer simulation, you can see the flying buttresses on the sides of the building here and here. And then they would just put a peak on top of the rib groin vaults that would be the main building. So let's take a look at some photos of this and see how this all works. Here are some photos of the exterior of Amiens Cathedral, and what you can see here is there are flying buttresses on the exterior that support the nave that runs down there, and these big tall windows that contain stained glass. And what I'd like to do is actually take a look and compare Pisa Cathedral against a Gothic cathedral. So we're looking at Pisa Cathedral that dates from the middle of the 11th century and comparing it against Amiens Cathedral. And the main architect for Amiens Cathedral is actually a guy named Robert de Lussarche, and it literally means Robert Light Arches, so he was kind of named after his architectural prowess. And if you compare the two buildings, what you'll see essentially is that the Pisa complex is a very horizontal, short, squat building, whereas Amiens Cathedral is very tall, thin. It points straight up. You have a lot of courses in the building that sort of defy the horizontality of the division. You see pointed arches in it. You'll also notice that two of the towers look a little bit different. And that really is because these buildings grow up almost organically over time. It took a long time to build this. 1220 to 1288 are the main building phases for this building, which means that you'd have one person starting on it, and it would be generations before a building would be finished. This allows for them to sort of change the design as they're moving along, and in a way they don't have a clear, simple plan the way that you might have, for instance, on the Parthenon. They took generations to build the buildings because each piece is carved and hand fitted. You'll also see in the front of the building there's a big round window in the center just above the central nave and the central portal, and that's called a rose window. And the way they would put those together is kind of like the tracery that we saw on the groin vaults. What they would do is carve it on the ground and then pin it together with wrought iron pins, and then they would put stained glass in between. So the development of stained glass is something we're going to talk about also significantly in a little bit. So the main ideas here are Romanesque is short and squat, very horizontally banded. The Gothic style is tall, vertical, with a lot of vertical thrust to it and pointed arches that sort of make the building seem as if it's a skyscraper pointing up towards God. Here's another shot of the building. You can see that they've even done away with the dome that we first looked at on Pisa Cathedral, the Duomo, and they have a spire in the center where the transept crosses the main building, the nave. Here's two shots of basically the exterior of the building showing some of the flying buttresses that support the nave structure. I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of look at that a little bit more. And next, what we're going to be doing is looking at the portals and looking at the sculpture. And this is going to relate an awful lot to the Romanesque sculpture, especially Gisli-Berdis's at Autun Cathedral. And so you have three main doorways, which fits in with the whole tripartite division, which is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And you have a series of arches within arches within arches, and then a tympanum in the center. And we're going to focus especially on a jamb figure, which is a figure that's called Beau Dieu, which in French just literally means beautiful God. So this is the central portal, and what we're looking at is this figure of Jesus who is located, heaven is identified as a Gothic cathedral. And to the right and left of him are figures that are called jamb figures that are basically almost like caryatids on the Porch of the Maidens in the Acropolis of ancient Greece from about 450. Underneath these jamb figures, you have a series of relief sculptures, which I want you to think of them as similar to the metopes and to the carving that we saw on, for instance, the Areopagus Auguste, but they're probably closer to the Parthenon's metopes that show the battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. And they contain, for instance, astrological and astronomical kinds of information. So the big concept first is that Gothic cathedrals are ornately carved because they are literally sermons in stone. And what you could do is you could walk around this building and you can identify the saints and you can identify lessons. It's meant to instruct you in how to behave yourself and what kinds of things you need to pay attention to. If we take a look at the door jamb figure, the first thing that I want to point out is that you have this figure of Jesus who is blessing us. Underneath him is actually a figure of probably an earthly king, probably King David. And above Jesus is the sort of dome of heaven that looks like a Gothic cathedral. And we're going to study that a little bit more. But I want to suggest to you is that there's actually a hierarchy created in how this figure is sculpted and who is the most important character. Because if you look at the photo on the right-hand side, you'll see Jesus is in the center, and then to the left and the right of him are the door jamb figures who are probably saints and apostles, and they are at a slightly lower level than him. Beneath all of them are actually the earthly king, and I'm pointing at it with the cursor here. This is probably an earthly king, King David, who serves as a support. Above him, in this sort of impost block between the two figures, is actually an ornament that is similar to things we saw in the Areopagus Auguste. It's a series of vines, and we see it in early Christian art too, that Christianity is like a vine. think it would help to compare and contrast the two traditions, the earliest tradition from the Roman era, and this is Augustus of Prima Porta from the 1st century, and it would have been a painted sculpture that was almost garish, but it's also much more naturalistic. And we compare it against Baudu here from Amiens Cathedral. And what I want to point out to you is that, first of all, in terms of formal stuff, the Gothic style is much less realistic. It's not as naturalistic as the classical Roman style. And there are reasons for this we'll discuss in a minute. The head is much larger than it should be in the Gothic style, which relates also to the earlier Byzantine styles that we've looked at. The drapery, though, is starting to become a little bit more realistic. It's a little bit more from observation, but we're lacking contrapposto pose. Now, both of these are deities. Remember that Augustus had been declared actually a god on the earth at one point, and Livia, when she had this sculpted to represent him, he has bare feet to represent his ascension, his divinity. And the iconography between the two show different kinds of divinities, if you think about it, and really tie in with the ideology of each of the periods. So, for instance, Augustus is a military guy. He's wearing a cuirass. He has the scepter that shows he's the leader of the Roman Senate. His bare feet probably either represent victory on land, or that he's been apotheosized. That means he's ascended to a godlike status. And the Cupid on the back of the dolphin at his feet actually represents that he is descended from the gods, from Venus, and also might represent victory at sea. And he is holding his hand in the pose of a master speaker. He's delivering a lecture to the Senate. And this is based in an earlier sculpture that we looked at, the Aulus Metellus. Now, if you look at Jesus in the left-hand image, we have kinds of similar cognates between the two, but Jesus is blessing us, and he is holding a holy book. It's either the Libris Mundi or the Holy Bible. And he is not standing in contrapposto, and he has his feet on these two sort of weird monster-like creatures that we're going to look at a little bit more closely in a second. And above him is the dome of heaven, which is literally a Gothic cathedral. So what they're doing is they're saying Gothic cathedrals are heaven on earth, and they are the portals to the heavenly realm. Now, the reason probably why they play down the naturalism in Christian art is so that you don't confuse it with an idol, that you don't think that it's real and that you worship it. But another idea might be that they just sort of lost the knack at that point in time for naturalism, because in the Renaissance later on, it comes back. Now, looking at Baudu, or this sculpture of Jesus, I want to relate it to the 91st Psalm, which we also looked at when we were studying San Vitale. And the highlighted yellow text is probably the most important text, but I want to make a relationship for you, or talk about this relationship of the scripture and the Psalms to the actual sculpture and the building, and again reiterate the point that the term sermons in stone is applicable here, that you're supposed to actually relate what you've learned in the church literally to what the sculptures look like. So we have that here. At his feet, in the 91st Psalm, it says, "You will tread upon the lion and the cobra, you will trample the great lion and the serpent." And we can see that he's kind of trampling on these chimeras, these weird creatures. Now, they wouldn't know what a cobra really looked like, and they wouldn't know what a lion looked like. But I think that in different versions of the Psalm, they also describe them as different kinds of creatures. And the whole idea of the 91st Psalm is basically that God is going to protect you, and that you are, when you're under his protection, under his wings, nothing bad will happen to you. And what we're seeing is this holy figure. He's got bare feet, and he's literally stopping the evil from happening by stomping it down, or by surmounting it and being more powerful than it is. The quatrefoils, quatra means four, and then foil, which just means a frame or an outline, on the left-hand side are from the base underneath the jamb figures on the exterior of the building. And what I want to do is suggest that they relate somewhat to the metapiece from the Parthenon from about 450 BCE, sculpted by Phidias or Phidias, depending on who you're teacher pronounces it. And what we have here in the left-hand side is a relief sculpture that depicts, in a similar way to the Lapith and the Centaur on the right-hand side, the top one are the Gemini twins, and they're split in half, right? So we've got this symmetrical composition, and then underneath it is actually someone seated in a springtime landscape, which relates to the period of time, I think it's May for the Gemini. And so what they're doing is they're actually telling you, it kind of ties in with one of the Psalms. You probably heard it as a song by the Birds, to everything turn, 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 there's a season, turn, turn. In this instance, what they're trying to relate to you is that God is a divine scientist, a divine geometer, and the Gothic architecture really does relate to this in quite a strong way. And what I'm suggesting is, during the Gothic period, the building of Gothic cathedrals uses a lot of science and physics to figure things out. And at this point in time, Thomas Aquinas actually wrote a proof for the existence of God. And these things sort of come together or relate in a way that God is a divine scientist, he's a divine geometer, he created the system in which we live. And so if you were to look at astrology and astronomy, and they didn't think of them as witchcraft at that point in time, they were actually kind of a pseudoscience, that if you look at those things, you can actually figure out the system that God has created. And this plays out again in the architecture of the Gothic cathedral as well. So we're going to take a closer look at that in just a minute. The next thing that I want to point out is that we have a combination of some high and low relief, and in a way the Gothic period is starting to evolve back into naturalism, and we can see that there's some drapery. It's not exactly wet drapery that we see, for instance, in the right-hand figure, but we're even starting to see a little bit of a humanistic gesture or eurythmic gesture in the figures as well. Now, what we're looking at here is a diagram of the early Gothic and high Gothic styles, and you can see that over time each one of the buildings gets more and more complex and more complicated, and they're trying to outdo one another. And one of the functions of the Gothic cathedral, aside from glorifying God by making something that is in honor of God, is you're making a touristy kind of destination. And there were pilgrimages to the different cathedrals. So every time they built a new Gothic cathedral, they were trying to outdo other cities, and often they would literally fall down and fall apart. But so if we look at the diagramming, you'll see that it relates to the actual building. You can see the rib groin vaults inside the photograph on the right-hand side. And then what the other thing is, if you look at the piers, they have a series of pilasters, which are flattened pillars that cluster around the piers themselves. I'll point at them for you. And these piers, with these extra tubes of stone, probably actually serve to shore up and support the arches and funnel the force down into the foundation of the building. So everything that's built in the Gothic cathedral is meant to funnel force, but it also is that idea of the forms that you see in the building are fully functional, but at the same time they're also very beautiful. I don't think photographs actually do a lot of justice to Gothic cathedrals in some ways and how the light would feel, so I found this computer-generated image of what a Gothic cathedral would feel like. And what I want to show you and talk about are the windows. I think one of the biggest innovations in Gothic cathedral, which you don't see in any other buildings, is that the clerestory is built super tall and it has these windows in it. But these windows, these stained glass windows, also serve a didactic purpose. They actually communicate ideas and communicate messages. And so if you were a priest and you were delivering a sermon, you could actually point at a window for the illiterate masses and tell them to visualize the story by looking at the pictures. So what I want to do is look at one of the windows from Chartres Cathedral and look at it as the scenes from the life of Christ. Now, the window that we're looking at actually has I have a diagram on the left-hand side of the screen, and you can see that the window, it's sort of almost like disco lighting. There's a lot of light coming in and out of the windows. And the stained glass windows relate significantly to manuscripts and to the designs that you'll find in a lot of manuscripts. And so what I want to do is kind of zoom in on some of the scenes about the life and times of Jesus, but I also want to talk a little bit about the organization of the window itself. And what you're seeing is there's actually a hierarchy where you have the celestial bodies at the top, the sun and the moon, and the Virgin and Child surmount the window at the very top of the image. Then you have this almost kind of the life and times of Jesus, where you have the betrayal, the triumphal entrance into Jerusalem, the crowds in Jerusalem, and you have underneath that this sort of supporting stories from the Old Testament, and these are sort of typologies: the flight into Egypt, King Herod. They're all early in the life of Jesus, and then at the very bottom you have the Annunciation and the nativity scenes. So let's take a look at some of those scenes, because I think that they relate directly to art that you're going to be studying later on in the Gothic and in the Renaissance period. So for instance, if we look at the triumphal entry panel, if you look at this, this is actually looks an awful lot like the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus. There's a scene of Jesus entering Jerusalem, and it relates to a Bible passage in which he asks his disciples to go get him a foal and an ass, a donkey, and he rides into town, and it's Palm Sunday. And you can see behind him are all the apostles kind of following behind him, and they're overlapped. And in the underneath the horse or the donkey are actually the palm leaves that the kids have strewn on the road. And Jesus looks very severe here and very intense. Now, I also want to show you a couple of the other scenes. For instance, when we studied the capital from Autun Cathedral that Gisli-Berdis carved, it had the Dream of the Magi, and so we're going to see that again here. You can see it contains all the same elements of the Dream of the Magi that we saw from the capital at Autun Cathedral. It has the star, it has the angel announcing, and it has the 3 sleeping magi on it. And so there's this idea of schema and correction, where they're actually plagiarizing from each other. They keep borrowing from earlier time periods. Nobody would have had a problem with this back in the Middle Ages or in the Romanesque and Gothic periods. It was just assumed that you would go to a church, or you would look at a manuscript, and you would sort of steal the designs and use them, because it was all in the glory of God. The last one that I want to look at, or the last two, one is an Annunciation. And the Annunciation scene is going to also significantly relate to a later work of art by Niccolo Pisano that we're going to look at actually back again in the Romanesque era. And what we have here is the angel Gabriel is announcing to Mary, and she is seated on a throne, and she actually has the Bible in her hand, and he is announcing to her that she is going to have the child Jesus, who is going to be the Son of God and be an earthly manifestation of God on the earth. And you can see that Gabriel is almost sort of curtsying towards her, and she almost seems as if she's sort of pulling back or recoiling away. That pose is going to be more and more pronounced over time when we get into more humanistic kinds of painting and portrayals of Mary and the Annunciation. The nativity scene also relates to this. And so we see here is the nativity scene where Mary is reclining, almost like a Byzantine sculpture. It also relates to the 3 goddesses that we saw in the Parthenon. Joseph is usually located in the outskirts of the picture plane in most of these things, because I think that in terms of the iconography and symbolism of Gothic art and Catholic art in general, you're really not sure what you're supposed to do with Joseph, because he's kind of this figure who never actually does anything except for help to raise Jesus. He's not really the father of Jesus because there was a virgin birth. And so he is often sort of relegated to the corners of compositions, but Mary becomes bigger and bigger and more important. We also see the Star of Bethlehem. We see an ox, which is both a symbol of the Nativity, but also the Guild of St. Luke, and we see the infant Jesus in swaddling cloth as well. So these are the main ideas that I want to get out of this window, that it's I think I used the term typological exegesis, and that's probably not really correct to describe it. It's really just a history of the life and times of Jesus and all of his stories. And so you can actually look this up and take a look at these scenes, and what you'll do is you'll see that they relate to other works of art that we've looked at, and typically the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus and some others. The next idea, we're going to be looking at another window from Chartres Cathedral, which is Our Lady of the Beautiful Window. And the main concept that I want you to look at here is you have Mary, who's seated in the center of the picture plane, And almost like cheerleaders or caryatid kinds of pillars are these angels to the left and the right of her that are sort of supporting her, and they're framing devices. They're almost like an architectural device that frame her in these different angels. Above her is a dove, which represents the Holy Spirit and is beaming light down on her, and she has a halo or a mandorla of light. And Jesus is seated on her lap. And this ties in with a typical symbol, which is the iconography of which is referred to as she is the throne of wisdom, and that on her lap, Mary is literally an earthly throne in which Jesus learned his earthly wisdom. Underneath that, you actually see some figures that are kind of holding up pillars and supporting her throne. And this is going to be a typical organization that we're going to come across in other works of art. So let's take a look at some more. I've zoomed in a little bit on the window, and I want to compare this Our Lady of the Beautiful Window from Chartres around 1145 to 1170 and compare it against Cimabue's painting of the Virgin enthroned. And what I'd like to suggest is that Cimabue and other panel painters got their iconography directly from stained glass windows and from Gothic cathedrals and also from manuscripts, and they just sort of they aped or copied a lot of the organizational principles that were in them. And so we have here Mary is larger than all the other characters, and the characters happen to be angels, and they're sort of on either side of her, almost voguing in a way that they are not in a typical, they're not regarding her in any way, they're just sort of looking out at the picture plane. And she is presenting her son, the infant Jesus, to us. And her drapery is actually very Byzantine style, very diagrammatic, cartoon-like. And her face is also Byzantine in style, so it's still a cartoon or a caricature. Remember how I pointed out underneath the Our Lady of the Beautiful Window just before, there was a sort of architectural structure, and we see here underneath a couple of saints who are almost the foundations on which things have been built. So we're going to talk about the transition of the Romanesque to the Byzantine style in the next lecture.